Joining me now is Associate Professor of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Cambridge, Finin. Rory, I appreciate you joining me this morning. I know it's pretty early. Do you agree, though, with Navy Admiral Tony Radakin that Russia is failing in Ukraine? I mean, Russian forces have increased attacks on Ukrainian cities over the last few weeks, even hitting new targets.
I think Navy Admiral Radakin is correct in his assessment that Russia is failing militarily, but we need to be thinking about short-term gains and short-term objectives and long-term gains and long-term objectives. I think Admiral Radakin is clear-eyed about the Kremlin's interests and its belief in its own endurance, that it can continue this war when the West cannot, when the world will not, that we will all around the world eventually lose interest. We can see this apathy setting in public journalistic discourse around the world, and that's why I really commend Channels Television for this program, for the fact that you call it a Russian invasion. That's very important in establishing for various publics around the world who's responsible for this war. So Admiral Radakin is correct that the Russian military is failing, and we can see that it's not been able to advance as vigorously as it's wanted, particularly in eastern Ukraine. This shows us, I think, over the long term, the means and approaches that the Kremlin will take in this war, which is to terrorize civilians, to try to break Ukraine's will. The problem there, of course, is that Ukrainians have shown in the darkest of hours that their will not be broken, because they have seen what happens when Russian military forces and political proxies occupy their territory. They've seen it in territory well beyond Ukraine, in Chechnya, in Transnistria, along the Moldovan border. They've seen the gray zone that has become Crimea, which doesn't really have a future. So the choice is very stark for Ukrainians: existence or victory, and that's the way we need to be thinking about this war as well.
Yeah, but the tenacity of the Ukrainians is really commendable. But if you do monitor, Russia's movement across Ukraine, especially in the eastern part of the country now, and all the cities that it seems to be bombarding at the moment, Mykolaiv being the most recent, you will agree that, it's only a matter of time, though, before the Ukrainians begin to feel a bit weary of this war.
We're so far into this war, and I think the question of fatigue and will is one we need to always ask in the context of a military engagement like this one. But the Ukrainian populace has been, I think, energized by the brutality of this invasion. And if their backs have not been broken and their will has not been broken, to this point, I don't see it changing. The issue here is, of course, how much damage can be done against the Russian military. So we need to be, of course, focusing on the provision of advanced artillery weaponry from the West to Ukraine. That's made a big difference in eliminating various Russian ammunition depots across occupied eastern Ukraine and along the south above the Azov Sea. These have been very big strategic gains. They also do not target civilian areas as well. So these are surgical targets that this weaponry is able to achieve. And I think those victories on the Ukrainian side show us that the only choice Russia has right now is, as you put it in your segment earlier, it's blackmail. It's terrorizing civilians. This is a regime lurching from one evil act to another. The Ukrainian side has been trying to maintain that moral high ground, and I think it's done so. And we need to, around the world, keep focusing on three major things here: that this is a neo-colonial war of conquest and aggression, that this is a war that's genocidal in nature, that is, it's seeking to eliminate a freestanding Ukrainian national identity and those who embrace it. And the third is that this war, again, is something that the Kremlin sees as a long-term proposition, that this isn't going to be something that will be concluding in the coming months. And I think the world has to decide here to make the clear-eyed decision that we need to support a Ukrainian victory, because the outcome, any other outcome would be, I think, disastrous, not only for Ukraine, but for the world order such as it is. We need to be very clear that our legal institutions are severely wounded already by the Russian invasion, and that it is seeking to, harm civilians all across the world through this hunger policy, and that is a threat to everyone everywhere.
But you still find Russia thriving, even though it is in isolation to much of the rest of the world, all thanks to the sanctions from the European Union and all of the countries within NATO.
I think we have to keep in mind that the sanctions regime is something we need to look at from a long-term objective too. That these sanctions that many of us thought would be disastrous for the Russian economy, they didn't quite have the impact and consequence that we had anticipated. But that was because the Kremlin had been preparing for this moment for quite some time. And they also are very clear in their own discourse, if one watches Russian state television, to the various comments made by different representatives of the Kremlin. They're very convinced that the world's going to lose interest in this, that the world is going to eventually stop backing Ukraine. And that's why, of course, we as viewers, as citizens, need to keep that support going for as long as we can, to express an international solidarity, to deliver the weapons that Ukraine can use to defend itself, to keep supporting it financially, and to show that we actually have a backbone and a will as well, because we understand the broader geopolitical and moral stakes of this kind of war, in which one country invades and bombards citizens of another simply because it can, simply because it considers it a colony, simply because it considers it less of a state than itself. This is a very dangerous way of thinking that we can see spill into countless other global conflicts if we don't stop this now. So the sanctions, I think, is something that we need to keep increasing, but we need to be thinking about how over the next 6 months, 12 months, are these sanctions eventually going to put Putin in a corner and to cause people around him to be thinking differently about this particular leadership. The one thing I appreciate in your segment as well is this clear-eyed view about the Russian public support of this war. At least half the country is supportive of this conflict, partly because they've been fed lies through Russian disinformation channels for a very long time, absurd lies about Nazis and extreme nationalists in Ukraine. Couldn't be farther from the truth. Ukraine is a place where far-right nationalism is, in relative terms, a very minority political position. There's no far-right party in parliament, for instance. Contrast that with a host of other European countries, and you see how Ukraine is quite different. So these lies have been, I think, affecting the Russian public for a very long time. And then those lies latch on to a long, I think, centuries-old colonial chauvinist view of Russians toward Ukraine and Ukrainians. And that's become a poisonous brew that sadly we're not going to be able to solve anytime soon.
Rory, it's been a real pleasure speaking with you. Thank you for joining me this morning.
Thank you.
Now, after the break, the European Union asked for patience on anti-Russia sanctions. See you soon.